And finally, Mr. Eugene Collins.
Eugene Collins, here representing statewide convention for the NAACP down in Louisiana. And I'm also the president of the Baton Rouge branch of the NAACP. If y'all don't mind, can I take this coat off? This is a little hot, I'm a big boy. Yeah, sorry.
It's all good. I see.
There you go.
Purposeful shirt.
So over there?
Over there.
All right, there we go.
All right, now that we're all situated, we can jump right into questions.
When you talk about world events and how it influences race, the trauma that's attached to sometimes the things that we see, right? You line up one night and you're looking at IG or you're scrolling your Facebook page or your TikTok page, depending on your age group. You can see things that just bring automatic trauma, especially for people of color, people that look like me, right? Because we've had some type of situation, we've had some kind of encounter or something that happened that a sheer video can bring you back to that moment, right? So that's how world events sometimes affect the local things, because we'll ask often locally, how can somebody get killed in Minnesota? We march in Baton Rouge, right? Because to us, that feels like our brother, right? That feels like it happened to us. It feels like it happened around the corner because we grew up on 38th Street where we saw this happen all the time. The only difference now is that you have a cell phone, right? With the capabilities of doing a little video. So that trauma that comes out sometimes in seeing these events can affect right here. And they say that racism is embedded into the fabric. I'm going to tell you that it's in the soil, right? You got to think about how this country was founded. We don't want to talk about that enough, but Thanksgiving ain't happy for everybody, right? It's buried into the freaking soul. We know for a fact, even though some historians will sometimes debate the fact, but Thomas Jefferson coined the term race to justify the treatment of slavery. Even though that's debatable, we know that it took place. And we can see the aftermath of its effects. And until we deal with this core issue of where it started in the soil, racism will always be something that exists in this country. And see, unlike some folks, I can handle a bigot, right? Because they out. You know where they're coming from. But it's those undercover racists that bother me. They're quiet. They sit in the boardrooms with us, right? Yeah. They hide in the chat rooms. They go to our clubs, right? That racism is so deeply rooted that I think it could sit in a lot of people, but they never express it. And that's the scary part because it comes out in the intake process of their clinic, right? It comes out in the intake process when they're looking at student applications at colleges. It comes out in how they respond when they're in that police car with those sirens to a black and brown community. I can deal with a bigot. It's the undercover racists I can't stand.
You have been dubbed.
Okay, I've been dubbed. When you think about the first part of that question, right? When you talk about some white people not wanting to hear about racism and privilege from a black or brown person, that right there highlights privilege. Like, what gives you the right to want to make that decision about who is qualified to teach you or not, right? And then when you look at that in reverse, we're an organization founded by both black and white people. And sometimes we get criticism for that, right? That some of our founders were white and some of our founders were black. The white people knew that we would always need an organization to act as a check and balances system as black people got more freedoms in this country. And the black people supported that. W.B. Du Bois, he was a huge person around anti-lynching, so he brought that thought. And some of the other thoughts were brought. The first thing we would call was the Niagara movement, right? So when you look at those things, we have always had allies in different spaces. The problem comes in when we don't respect that space. Y'all know what I mean. And I ain't talking about y'all white folks in here, but sometimes white folks just come in the room and do too much, right? I'm just going to keep it real for a second. And that's not speaking bad to anything, because sometimes I feel like black people come in the room and do too much, right? And let's get this sense out of the room just because you black that you know me. My grandmother always told me, all skin folk ain't kin folk. So it ain't always about them being black. My son, who is the typical middle-class, privileged kid, right? You would not bring him into some spaces because you would be disappointed because he doesn't know some things. I remember one time I picked him up from his mom's house and I took him to the hood and I dropped him off because I was disappointed in some things he had said, right? And his mama called me like an hour later, frantic, like, what are you doing? He ain't built like that. In my head, I knew that. In my heart, I wanted to believe different, right? But in reality, it wasn't just about the fact that he was a black. It was also about his income. Because in 2022, you can't have a conversation around race without having a conversation about class. And we talked about those movements, and my colleague Devontae spoke to it about how different the movement is, right? If you look at the movement in the 50s and 60s, we were all seeking jobs and justice, right? You look at the 60s and the 70s, again, it's jobs and justice. Now you get towards to the 80s, some of you black folks got a little money, right? So your fight ain't necessarily jobs no more. And depending on what zip code that you live in, your fight ain't justice either. So now we're dealing with a situation where we have to acknowledge that black people are no longer a monolith. We're very different. We're very different sets of ideals that can change by neighborhood to neighborhood, zip code to zip code. So you can't have the conversation about race without addressing class. And I always tell folks, even if you want to be an ally, walk into that room and realize that you haven't sat or lived through those experiences, right? And respect that. And there's certain things, I'm just going to keep it real, there's certain things that we just don't want to hear from white people. And they're pushing some pathways program in Baton Rouge, which is about getting kids enrolled in both high school and college at the same time without option. The narrative to that is that our kids aren't capable because they aren't reading at a certain level. And guess what? That narrative might be correct, but I don't want to hear from a white person. Bottom line. Send me a black administrator to tell me that. Because I can't go to 38th Street and tell those people a white person told me. Can't do it. And getting people to acknowledge that sometimes is very difficult because they get offended and say, oh, well, I was here with you. You know, I helped fund this. I worked tirelessly for this effort. But they don't realize you just got to respect the space. Even if you mean well, respect the space. Like my granddad always told me, sometimes you got to sit in the room and shut the hell up, you know? Don't say nothing. Maybe your presence is all that room needs. When we don't understand that, sometimes we overtalk. And it ain't just for the white people. Because there's some black folk that want to hear from you. And we have to acknowledge that. When you look at the social justice movement, one of the things that fears this new generation so much is that I can go to a small town in Bruley, Louisiana, and we can be there with some actions, right? Trying to change a law on a local level, trying to change a city ordinance, whatever. And we're fighting this body of white conservative males, right? Not even females. Because when you get down south in some of these smaller towns and you have a conversation with some of those men, you think you as a black person got it bad. Wait till you hear what they think about women, right? Just atrocious. But when you walk into the room, you see these 7 white men sitting at this table, but their kids are marching with you. And that's something they fear. Because when I look around, I say, we just got to get this a little bit more time because these folks behind me will change things, right? Mm-hmm. And they know that. So they got to get a grip on this generation, and this comes through education, but at the same time, I'm sometimes saddened that people that look like me don't always know the correct stuff, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at an institution that changed, at one point in our country's history, we had to sit at the back of the bus, right? And where did the bus boycott happen? First bus boycott, where did it happen? Montgomery. That's what you've been taught, right? But it wasn't. It actually happened in Baton Rouge. And we will often, sometimes now start to recognize Claudette Colvin, right? Mm-hmm. She actually sat on the bus before Rosa Parks. But did y'all know that there was a black woman that sat on the bus before both of them? Anybody know that? Her name was Martha White. Martha White decided to get on the bus one day and not get up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which sparked the bus boycott, which only lasted 7 days. And there was some criticism of that because some people in the city wanted the boycott to last longer, but it only took 7 days to get to some of the goals that they wanted to achieve, right? So it was actually Martha White first, but we have been taught something that we never looked into. Like folks want to tell us Dr. King got killed fighting for racial rights, right? Fighting racism. But in reality, if you study the Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King got killed when he started bringing poor people together. You gotta trust me, Google it.
Thank you, thank you.
That's the fact, right? So we don't talk about Dr. King's work around the Vietnam War. We don't talk about Dr. King's work around handicap ramps. We don't talk about Dr. King's strategy probably being the foundation for the LGBTQ movement, right? We don't discuss that. We discuss bits and pieces of the institution that we've been taught and we never dug for. We don't talk about that. This federally qualified health center model that we see is probably copied from some of the community health models the Black Panthers implemented. We forget to mention that. So as we study this institutional racism, we got to also study this institutional lack of knowledge. And as my colleague said, Mr. Devontae for sure, we've been fighting very hard the remapping, redistricting efforts in Louisiana, but we've been fighting for a population that largely does not know what redistricting is, does not know the understanding. Because we've been told specific things that people wanted us to know. And if I've got to spend one more Black History Month listening to I Have a Dream, which is a speech that Dr. King never wanted to give, and if you ever find a good recording of it, you'll hear Mahalia say, tell him about the dream, because she was reassuring him to keep going. If I've got to hear that speech one more time, I'm going to flip out. Y'all, we recite that speech every year, and the man didn't even want to give it. We got to face the truth. If we really want to attack these institutions about how these things came about. Because if we're not working with facts, we're just working with what folks told us with no research or study, we're probably leading people in the wrong direction.
Romanticizing it too.
Yeah.
You're romanticizing the movement, really. That's what's happening.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask you a question, sister. You know, it don't sound like you got a choice because you ain't got no Black professors at the school, right? So the class might start with a white professor. I do agree with my colleague's sentiments. But why isn't there a Black professor?
That's
why
the question you
isn't
should
one
be
staying?
asking.
Well, because of the area that we're surrounded in, I mean, to be honest, our decline in Black students altogether had happened, especially with the presidential election. There was a lot of Trump rallies, we were being called the N-word, like we did not feel safe as Black students on Marshall campus.
Mm-hmm.
So I know for a fact that professors don't want to come because it's not appealing. But like, there's nothing to do either. So like, I know why, it's just, I'm trying to figure out a way to make it appealing or like figure out a way to get professors to come.
When I hear what you're saying, I hear the need to organize, right? To get the Black students that are left together and figure out how can you get Black students back into that bubble? How can you get Black professors? And is the city surrounding that campus doing enough to keep y'all safe? So if that's a problem, call in the NAACP in your region, right? Call in the Urban League in your region. Call in somebody. Hell, I'll come up there. I'll bring Will Smith with me.
Too soon.
Something, right? Because there's people around this country that would help y'all, and y'all just don't have to go through that, right?
Yeah.
Because when you say that, I just see a larger issue in all of that that needs to be dealt with.